The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before Jack Morrison, its red earth baking under the merciless afternoon sun. His horse, a weathered bay mare named Dusty, plodded forward with the resigned patience of an animal that had traveled too many miles with a rider who had nowhere particular to go. Jack pulled his hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare that seemed to bounce off every rock and cactus in sight. 3 months had passed since he'd left the ranch in Colorado. 3 months since the fever took Sarah and little Tommy, leaving him with nothing but memories that cut deeper than any blade. The other ranchers had offered him work, sympathy, a place to stay until he got back on his feet. But Jack couldn't bear their pitying looks or their well-meaning words about God's plan and better places. So he'd saddled Dusty, packed what little he owned, and rode south into the vastness where a man could disappear entirely. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it the metallic scent of approaching rain. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, moving fast across the desert floor. Jack knew enough about Arizona weather to recognize the signs of a flash storm, the kind that could turn dry arroyos into raging torrents in minutes. "Come on, girl," he murmured to Dusty, urging her toward a line of red sandstone cliffs in the distance. "We need shelter." The first fat raindrops began to fall as they reached the base of the cliffs. Jack dismounted and led Dusty along the rock face, searching for an overhang or cave. The rain was coming harder now, each drop striking the ground with the force of a small bullet. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that echoed off the canyon walls like cannon fire. Then he saw it. A dark opening in the cliff face, partially hidden by a cluster of juniper trees. The cave entrance was narrow but tall enough for a man to walk through upright. Jack quickly led Dusty inside, grateful to escape the storm that was now unleashing its full fury on the desert. The cave was deeper than he'd expected, extending back into the cliff for 30 feet or more. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Jack noticed something that made him pause. The walls were covered with paintings, not the crude scratches he might have expected, but carefully crafted images in red and white pigment. Handprints, animal figures, and geometric designs covered the smooth sandstone surfaces. This was an Apache sacred site. Jack had heard enough stories from old-timers to recognize the significance of such a place. He felt a moment of unease, wondering if he was trespassing on ground that wasn't meant for him. But the storm outside was growing more violent, and Dusty was already settling into the dry space near the entrance. As he moved deeper into the cave to explore, something caught his eye. Unlike the older paintings, which had the faded appearance of age, one symbol near the back wall looked fresh. It was a circular design with radiating lines, painted in what appeared to be a mixture of red clay and plant dyes. The pigment was still vibrant, suggesting it had been applied recently, perhaps within the last few days. Jack studied the symbol more closely. It reminded him of a sun, but there was something else about it, a quality that seemed both protective and welcoming. Below it, someone had placed a small collection of items, a bundle of sage, 3 perfectly round stones, and what looked like corn pollen in a tiny leather pouch. The storm continued to rage outside, and Jack realized he would be spending the night here whether he liked it or not. He unsaddled Dusty and rubbed her down with his blanket, then set up his own small camp near the entrance where he could watch the lightning illuminate the desert in brilliant flashes. As darkness fell and the storm finally began to subside, Jack found himself drawn back to the fresh symbol on the wall. In the flickering light of his small fire, it seemed almost alive, the radiating lines appearing to pulse with gentle warmth. He spread his bedroll beneath it, feeling strangely comforted by its presence. Sleep came easier than it had in months, and with it, dreams. Not the nightmares that usually haunted him, memories of Sarah's fevered face and Tommy's small body growing still, but something different entirely. In his dream, he heard a woman's voice singing a melody unlike anything he'd ever heard before. The words were in a language he didn't understand, but the emotion behind them was universal: loss, hope, and a deep connection to the land that surrounded them. The voice seemed to come from the painted symbol itself, as if the unknown artist had somehow captured not just pigment on stone, but a piece of her very soul. When Jack woke at dawn, the song was still echoing in his mind, and for the first time since leaving Colorado, he felt something other than emptiness in his chest. Outside, the desert had been washed clean by the storm, and the morning air smelled of sage and wet earth. As Jack prepared to leave, he found himself reluctant to go. Something about this place, about that symbol and the voice from his dream, had touched him in a way he couldn't explain. Before mounting Dusty, he did something that surprised even himself. From his saddlebag, he pulled out a small tin cup and his water bottle. He filled the cup with fresh water and placed it carefully beside the other offerings beneath the painted sun. It seemed like the right thing to do, a gesture of respect for whoever had created this sacred space and shared it unknowingly with a lost cowboy in need of shelter. As he rode away from the cliffs, Jack found himself looking back more than once. The voice from his dream continued to echo in his memory, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be his last visit to the painted cave. Aiyana moved silently through the early morning shadows, her moccasined feet finding purchase on the familiar rocky path that led to the sacred cave. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air crisp and clean, filled with the scent of creosote and wet sage. In her woven basket, she carried fresh white clay, ground ochre, and new sage bundles, supplies for maintaining the sacred symbols that connected her people to their ancestors. She had been coming to this place since childhood, first with her grandmother, who taught her the old ways, then as a young woman learning the healer's path, and now she came seeking peace for a heart that had known too much sorrow. Her husband, Nalnish, had been gone for 2 seasons, killed in a skirmish with cavalry soldiers who had strayed too far from their designated patrol routes. The grief still sat heavy in her chest, a stone that grew heavier with each passing day. As she approached the cave entrance, Aiyana paused. Something was different. The juniper branches that partially concealed the opening had been disturbed, and there were marks in the earth, bootprints too large to belong to any of her people, and the distinctive hoofprints of a shod horse. Her hand instinctively moved to the knife at her belt as she crept closer to investigate. Inside the cave, her sharp eyes immediately spotted evidence of the intruder's presence. Ashes from a small fire near the entrance, impressions in the sand where a bedroll had been laid out, and the lingering scent of coffee and leather. But as she moved deeper into the sacred space, expecting to find damage or desecration, she discovered something that stopped her in her tracks. Beneath the sun symbol she had painted 3 days earlier, a prayer for guidance and healing, sat a small tin cup filled with clean water. The offering had been placed carefully, respectfully, alongside her own sacred items. Whoever had sheltered here had not taken anything or disturbed the ancient paintings. Instead, they had left a gift. Aiyana knelt beside the offering, studying it carefully. The cup was well worn but clean, the kind a cowboy might carry on long journeys. The water was fresh, probably from the stranger's own limited supply, a precious commodity in the desert that he had chosen to share with unknown spirits. This was not the act of someone who viewed this place as merely convenient shelter. She thought of the stories her grandmother had told, of the time before the great conflicts, when her people and the Mexican vaqueros sometimes shared waterholes and trading paths. There had been respect then, understanding that the desert was vast enough for all who treated it with reverence. Perhaps this stranger was cut from that older cloth. Rising to her feet, Aiyana made a decision that surprised her. Instead of removing the foreign offering, she accepted it as part of the sacred space. She freshened the water in the cup, added her own bundle of sage to the collection, and began the ritual of renewing the painted symbols. As she worked, grinding pigments and mixing them with sacred clay, her mind wandered to the dream she'd had the night before. In it, she had been singing the old healing songs while standing in this very cave, but instead of empty air, her voice had reached across a great distance to comfort someone in need. The dream had felt so real that she had awakened with the melody still on her lips. Working carefully, Aiyana refreshed the sun symbol and added new elements to the design, small spirals that represented the continuing journey of souls, and dots that marked the connection between earth and sky. As she painted, she found herself humming the song from her dream, her voice echoing softly off the cave walls. When the sacred work was complete, she sat back on her heels and studied her creation. The symbol seemed to pulse with life in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, as if it held not just pigment but intention. She had painted it as a prayer for her own healing, but now it felt like something more, a bridge between worlds, an invitation for understanding. Before leaving, Aiyana made her own addition to the collection of offerings. From her medicine bag, she drew out a small bundle of dried herbs, willow bark for pain, desert sage for purification, and a pinch of blessed corn pollen. She wrapped them carefully in soft deerskin and placed them beside the tin cup. If the respectful stranger returned, he would find medicine that could ease body and spirit. As she prepared to leave, something made her pause at the cave entrance. Call it instinct or the whisper of ancestral wisdom, but she felt certain that this would not be the last time their paths would cross in this sacred space. The thought should have troubled her. Her people had good reason to be wary of unknown white men in their territory, but instead, she felt a curious sense of anticipation. The sun was climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Aiyana made her way back toward her camp, but found herself looking over her shoulder at the cliff face that concealed the painted cave. In the growing heat of the day, she could swear she still heard the echo of her own voice singing the healing song, as if the stone walls had captured the melody and would release it when the time was right. Miles away, Jack Morrison was making camp beside a small spring, but his thoughts kept returning to the cave and the mysterious voice from his dream. Neither of them knew it yet, but the sacred space had already begun weaving their destinies together, one careful thread at a time. That night, both the Apache healer and the grieving cowboy would dream again of singing voices and painted symbols, their souls calling across the vast desert to offer each other the healing they had been seeking alone. Jack had been riding in circles for 2 weeks, telling himself he was exploring the territory, looking for work, maybe a place to settle. But every path seemed to lead him back toward the red cliffs that housed the painted cave. On this particular evening, as purple shadows stretched across the desert and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, he finally admitted to himself what he'd known all along. He was returning to the only place that had brought him peace since Sarah and Tommy died. Dusty seemed to sense his destination, picking up her pace as they approached the familiar rock face. Jack dismounted and led her toward the cave entrance, expecting to find everything just as he'd left it. But as he stepped inside and his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he stopped short. His tin cup was still there, but it had been refilled with fresh water. More surprising still, a small bundle wrapped in soft leather sat beside it. Jack approached slowly, as if sudden movement might cause the offering to vanish like a mirage. With careful fingers, he unwrapped the deerskin to reveal dried herbs. Some he recognized, others completely foreign to him. The sage he knew, but the other plants were mysteries. One had a bitter scent that reminded him of medicine his mother used to brew for headaches. Another smelled sweet and clean, like the air after a spring rain. Whoever had left these gifts possessed knowledge he lacked entirely. Jack rewrapped the herbs carefully and placed them back beside the tin cup. Then he did something that felt both natural and strange. He added his own offering to the collection. From his saddlebag, he retrieved a piece of hardtack bread, still fresh from his last supply run to Tucson, and a small pouch of coffee beans. It wasn't much, but it was what he had to share. As he settled in for the night, Jack found himself studying the painted symbols more closely than before. The fresh sun symbol seemed different somehow, more complex than he'd first noticed. New spirals and dots had been added to the design, creating patterns that drew the eye inward, like a gentle whirlpool. It was beautiful work, created by someone with both artistic skill and deep spiritual intention. Sleep came easily again in this place, and with it the voice. This time the dream was clearer, more vivid. He could almost see the singer, a woman with long dark hair moving gracefully as she worked at something with her hands. Her song was different tonight, less mournful and more hopeful, as if she too had found some measure of peace. When Jack woke at dawn, he discovered fresh tracks around the cave entrance, moccasin prints that hadn't been there the night before. Someone had visited while he slept, someone who moved with the silence of morning mist. A chill ran down his spine as he realized how vulnerable he'd been, how easily the unknown visitor could have harmed him if they'd chosen to. But instead of feeling threatened, Jack found himself curious. The mysterious person could have confronted him, driven him away from what was clearly their sacred space. Instead, they had continued the silent exchange of gifts, indicating acceptance, perhaps even welcome. Before leaving, Jack made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months before. He pulled out his pencil and a piece of paper from his journal and wrote a simple message. "Thank you for sharing this peaceful place. The herbs smell like healing. I left coffee and bread. J.M." He folded the paper carefully and placed it under a small stone beside the other offerings, then stepped back to look at the collection one more time. Tin cup, herbs, bread, coffee, paper. A strange altar built by strangers who had never met but somehow understood each other's need. As he rode away from the cave, Jack felt lighter than he had in months. The exchange of gifts had created something he hadn't expected, a connection to another human being that required no words, no explanations, no painful sharing of stories. Just simple recognition that they were both seekers of peace in a harsh world. 3 days later, Aiyana returned to the cave for her regular visit. The sight of the additional offerings brought a smile to her lips, the first genuine smile she'd worn since Nalnish's death. She examined the bread and coffee with interest, noting their quality and freshness. This stranger was not destitute. He chose to share from genuine generosity rather than desperate need. The paper beneath the stone puzzled her at first. She could recognize the marks as the white man's talking symbols, but she could not read their meaning. However, she understood the intent behind leaving it, an attempt at communication, a reaching across the divide between their worlds. That evening, she brought her own paper and charcoal to the cave. Unable to write words he would understand, she instead drew pictures: a simple sun, a curved line representing the desert horizon, and 2 small figures standing on opposite sides of a stream with their hands raised in greeting. At the bottom, she drew the outline of a hand and pressed her palm against the charcoal, leaving a clear handprint on the paper. She placed her drawing beside his note, then added her own gifts to the growing collection: a small clay pot filled with pine nut butter, strips of dried venison, and a beautiful piece of turquoise wrapped in sinew. As she worked, she found herself humming again, and the melody seemed to linger in the cave long after she departed. This pattern continued for weeks. Jack would arrive to find new gifts and messages, and would leave his own in return. The communication evolved from simple offerings to more personal exchanges. He left a small wooden horse he'd carved during long evening hours. She responded with an intricately woven grass bracelet. He shared pages from an old book of poetry. She left pictographs that told stories of desert animals and changing seasons. Neither had seen the other, but through these silent exchanges, they were building something unprecedented. A friendship based not on words or shared culture, but on mutual respect and the universal language of kindness. In a land where their peoples were often at odds, they had found a way to reach across the divide and touch each other's hearts. The painted cave had become more than a shelter or sacred space. It had become a bridge between 2 wounded souls who were slowly, carefully, teaching each other how to hope again. The drought had lasted 3 weeks, turning the usually reliable desert springs into cracked mud and forcing both man and beast to travel farther for water. Jack had pushed Dusty hard that day, following rumors of a hidden spring near the painted cliffs. The mare was exhausted, her sides heaving with each labored breath, and Jack knew they couldn't go much farther without rest. As they approached the familiar cave, Jack noticed something that made him rein in sharply. Smoke was rising from behind a cluster of rocks near the cliff base, not the thick black smoke of a large fire, but the thin, steady stream that came from a small, carefully tended cooking fire. Someone was camped nearby. Jack's first instinct was to turn around and leave. The silent exchanges in the cave had been precious to him, precisely because they required no human contact, no risk of disappointment or conflict. But Dusty needed water desperately, and he knew there was a small seep near the cave that usually held moisture even in dry times. Dismounting quietly, Jack led Dusty closer to investigate. As they rounded the rock formation, he saw her for the first time. The woman knelt beside a small fire, grinding something in a stone bowl with practiced rhythmic movements. Her long black hair was braided with feathers and small bones, and she wore a doe-skin dress decorated with intricate beadwork. Even from a distance, Jack could see the graceful economy of her movements, the careful attention she paid to her work. This had to be his mysterious friend from the cave. Jack stood frozen, uncertain what to do. Part of him wanted to retreat before she noticed him, to preserve the magic of their wordless friendship, but Dusty chose that moment to whinny softly, and the woman's head snapped up. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, they stared at each other across 30 feet of desert sand. Jack saw wariness in her dark eyes, but not fear. This was a woman accustomed to taking care of herself. Her hand moved instinctively toward something at her side, probably a knife, but she didn't draw it. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly, raising his hands to show they were empty. "My horse needs water. I didn't know anyone was here." The woman studied him carefully, taking in his worn clothes, his obvious exhaustion, and Dusty's condition. Then her gaze moved to his face, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. She spoke a few words in Apache, her voice melodious even in a language Jack couldn't understand. When he shook his head apologetically, she tried again in Spanish, then switched to carefully pronounced English. "You are the one who leaves gifts," she said. It wasn't a question. Jack nodded slowly. "You're the artist, the one who painted the sun." "Aiyana," she said, touching her chest. "Jack Morrison," he replied, following her gesture. They regarded each other in silence for a moment, both acutely aware that they were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The anonymous safety of their cave exchanges was gone, replaced by the complex reality of two people from different worlds meeting face to face. "Your horse is thirsty," Aiyana observed, noting how Dusty's head hung low. "Yes, I was hoping the seep near the cave might have water." Instead of answering directly, Aiyana rose gracefully and walked to where a large pottery jug sat in the shade. She poured water into a flat stone basin and carried it to where Dusty could reach it. The mare drank gratefully while Aiyana ran expert hands over her legs and flanks, checking for injuries. "She is strong but tired," Aiyana pronounced. "You have traveled far today." 3 days looking for water," Jack admitted. "I heard there might be a spring near here." "There is, but it is hidden. Difficult to find if you do not know the way." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I could show you, but first you must rest. The sun is too hot now for traveling." Jack felt a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Why would you help me? Your people and mine, and we're not exactly friends these days." Aiyana's expression grew thoughtful. "In the cave, you showed respect. You shared water when you had little. You left gifts instead of taking them. This tells me who you are better than the color of your skin." She gestured toward the small camp she'd made in the shade of an overhanging rock. "Sit. Rest. When the sun moves lower, I will take you to the spring." Jack hesitated, aware that accepting her hospitality would deepen whatever was happening between them. But Dusty needed water, and he was exhausted himself. More than that, he found himself curious about this woman who had been his anonymous friend for weeks. "Thank you," he said simply, leading Dusty into the shade. As the afternoon wore on, they shared a meal of pine nut cakes and dried meat, communicating in a mixture of English, Spanish, and gestures. Aiyana told him about her work as a healer, her knowledge of desert plants and their uses. Jack found himself talking about Dusty, about his wandering life, carefully avoiding the painful subject of why he'd left Colorado. But Aiyana seemed to sense the grief he carried, just as he had intuited her own loss through the melancholy songs he'd heard in his dreams. "You have lost someone," she said gently, as the shadows began to lengthen. Jack nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "My wife and son. Fever took them both. My husband," Aiyana replied simply. "Soldiers, 6 months ago." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who understood that some pain was too deep for words. The desert wind whispered through the rocks around them, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "In the cave," Aiyana said eventually, "I sang the healing songs. Sometimes I thought someone was listening." "I heard you," Jack admitted, "in my dreams. Your voice. It was the first thing that brought me peace since they died." Aiyana smiled, the same genuine expression Jack had hoped to see, but never expected to witness in person. "Perhaps that is why the spirits brought us both to the same place. Sometimes healing comes in ways we do not expect." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Aiyana kept her promise and led Jack to the hidden spring. It was a miraculous oasis tucked into a narrow canyon, fed by an underground stream that bubbled up through layers of rock. Jack filled his water containers while Dusty drank her fill, but his mind was on the woman who watched from the canyon rim. When he emerged from the canyon, Aiyana was preparing to break camp. "Will you return to the cave?" she asked. "I don't know," Jack said honestly. "Maybe it's different now that we've met." "Different, yes," Aiyana agreed, "but not necessarily worse. The cave brought us friendship. Perhaps it has more gifts to offer." As they parted ways, she heading north toward her people's camp, he continuing his aimless wandering, Jack carried with him the image of her smile and the sound of her voice speaking his name. The anonymous exchanges had been precious, but this was something else entirely. For the first time since leaving Colorado, he had met another human being who understood his pain and offered not pity, but companionship. That night, camping under a canopy of desert stars, Jack found himself planning his return to the painted cave. Whatever was growing between him and Aiyana, he wanted to nurture it. In a world that seemed determined to drive people apart, they had found a way to build bridges instead of walls. The autumn rains had come early to the Arizona desert, transforming the landscape into a tapestry of unexpected green. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and the air carried the rich scent of wet earth and growing things. Jack had been camped near the painted cave for 3 days now, not hiding from Aiyana but waiting, hoping she would return as she had promised. Their friendship had deepened over the months since their first meeting. They had established a pattern of encounters, sometimes planned, sometimes accidental, always welcome. Jack had learned to read the desert signs that indicated her presence in the area, while Aiyana had grown comfortable enough to seek him out when she needed help with tasks that required a man's strength or a horse's mobility. On this particular morning, as Jack sat by his small fire brewing coffee and watching the sunrise paint the cliffs in shades of gold and crimson, he heard the soft sound of approaching footsteps. Aiyana emerged from the morning shadows like a part of the landscape itself, carrying her medicine basket and wearing an expression of unusual seriousness. "Jack," she called softly, using the shortened version of his name she had adopted. "I have something to tell you." He rose to greet her, noting the tension in her posture. "What is it? Are you in trouble?" "Not trouble, exactly." She sat beside his fire and accepted the cup of coffee he offered, though she rarely drank the bitter brew. "My people are moving our winter camp farther north, away from the growing number of settlers and soldiers in this region. The elders believe it is safer." Jack felt his stomach drop. "When?" "Soon. Perhaps within the week." She stared into the fire, avoiding his eyes. "There is more. Some of the younger warriors talk of raiding parties, of striking back against those who push us from our traditional lands. They do not understand why I spend time with—" She gestured toward him, leaving the sentence unfinished. "With a white man," Jack completed quietly. "With anyone from outside our people during such uncertain times," she corrected gently. "They see enemies everywhere, and perhaps they are not wrong to be cautious." They sat in silence for a while, both understanding the implications. Their friendship, precious as it was to them both, existed in a fragile bubble that the harsh realities of the world were threatening to burst. "I could come with you," Jack said suddenly, surprising himself with the words. Aiyana looked at him with a mixture of affection and sadness. "You know that is impossible. Even if my people would accept you, which they would not, you do not belong in our world any more than I belong in yours." "Then what do we do?" The desperation in his voice was barely contained. "Pretend we never met? Go back to being strangers?" "No," Aiyana said firmly. "We do something better. We remember what we have learned from each other, and we carry it forward into whatever comes next." She reached into her medicine basket and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. "I have been working on this for many weeks," she said, carefully unwrapping a beautiful piece of pottery. It was a water vessel, painted with intricate designs that incorporated both Apache symbols and elements that clearly represented their friendship. The sun symbol from the cave, two figures standing beneath it, and flowing lines that suggested the meeting of two streams. "It's beautiful," Jack breathed, accepting the gift with reverent hands. "It is a story pot," Aiyana explained. "Among my people, we use such vessels to carry forward the stories that matter most. This one tells the story of how two wounded souls found healing through friendship, even when the world around them insisted they should be enemies." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I don't have anything nearly as meaningful to give you in return. You have already given me what I needed most," she replied. "You showed me that grief need not be a permanent prisoner of the heart. You reminded me that there is still kindness in the world, still reason to hope for better days." As if summoned by her words, both of them became aware of sounds in the distance. Horses approaching at speed, voices calling in Apache. Aiyana's expression immediately became guarded. "My brother and two of his friends," she said, recognizing the voices. "They have been tracking me, worried about my long absences from camp." Jack began to reach for his rifle, but Aiyana placed a restraining hand on his arm. "No weapons," she said urgently. "If they see you armed, there will be blood spilled here, and our friendship will be remembered only as another tragedy." The three Apache warriors rode into view, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with determination. The leader, a young man who shared Aiyana's strong features and graceful bearing, spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone clearly angry and demanding. Aiyana responded in the same language, her voice calm but firm. Jack couldn't understand the words, but he could read the tension in every line of her body, the protective stance she had unconsciously adopted between him and her brother. The conversation grew more heated, with the other two warriors adding their voices to what was clearly an argument. Finally, Aiyana's brother pointed directly at Jack and spoke a single word that needed no translation. "Enemy." "No," Aiyana replied in English, clearly wanting Jack to understand. "Friend." The simple declaration hung in the air like a challenge. Jack slowly rose to his feet, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening, and looked directly into the eyes of each warrior in turn. "I have great respect for your sister," he said clearly, speaking to Aiyana's brother, though the man might not understand English. "She has shown me kindness when I was lost and healing when I was broken. I would never bring harm to her or to your people." Aiyana translated his words, adding what Jack assumed were explanations of their months of friendship and the sacred nature of the cave where they had first connected. Her brother listened, his expression gradually shifting from anger to confusion to something approaching respect. Finally, the young warrior dismounted and approached Jack. He spoke a few words in Apache, which Aiyana translated. "He says you have honest eyes, and that our grandmother always taught us to judge people by their actions, not their appearance." Jack felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. Aiyana's brother continued speaking, his tone regretful but determined. "He says that regardless of who you are as a person, these are dangerous times," Aiyana translated. "He cannot guarantee your safety if you continue to meet with our people, and he cannot guarantee that others will be as understanding as he chooses to be." Jack nodded slowly, understanding the message. Their friendship, beautiful as it was, could not survive in a world increasingly divided by fear and conflict. "Tell him I understand," Jack said. "Tell him I'm grateful for his wisdom and his restraint." As the warriors prepared to leave with Aiyana, she turned back to Jack one final time. "The cave will always be sacred to both of us," she said softly. "When you visit there, know that you carry my friendship with you, just as I will carry yours wherever my path leads." "Will I see you again?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "In this life, probably not. But the spirits that brought us together are stronger than the forces that drive us apart. What we have built together will endure." She mounted her horse and rode away with her brother and his companions, turning once to wave farewell before disappearing into the desert landscape that had shaped them both. Jack stood alone beside his dying fire, clutching the story pot that contained the painted record of their impossible friendship. Around him, the desert continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human sorrow, but somehow still offering comfort to those who knew how to listen to its lessons. That evening, he made his way to the painted cave one final time. The sun symbol was still there, as vibrant as ever, surrounded now by dozens of other offerings left over the months of their friendship. Jack added the story pot to the collection, positioning it carefully so that its painted narrative faced the sacred symbol. As he settled down to sleep beneath the painted stars of the cave ceiling, Jack heard it one last time. Aiyana's voice carried on the desert wind, singing the healing songs that had first drawn him to this place. But now the melody held no sadness, only gratitude for the gift of connection that had transformed them both. When he woke at dawn, Jack knew it was time to leave the painted cave behind and continue his journey. But he carried with him something more valuable than gold or silver, the knowledge that even in a world torn by conflict and prejudice, friendship could still bloom between willing hearts. As he rode away toward whatever future awaited him, Jack Morrison was no longer the broken man who had first sought shelter in the sacred cave. He had been healed, not by forgetting his losses, but by learning that love could take many forms, including the pure friendship of a remarkable Apache woman who had taught him that hope was always possible, even in the darkest of times. Behind him, the painted cave held its secrets and its stories, waiting for the next wounded soul who might need reminding that in a vast and often cruel world, kindness still existed for those brave enough to seek it.